The prisoner, once feared by many, lay weak on a hospital bed. His body was frail, his face pale, and the machines surrounding him beeped softly as if keeping track of the time he had left. He had only a few days to live. Years behind bars had taken a toll on him, but it was the regret in his heart that weighed the most. He had made many mistakes in his life, but the biggest one was the way he treated his daughter, Emma. He had been a cruel father, never there for her when she needed him, and the guilt of his actions haunted him now, as his life slipped away. With his breath shallow and his hands trembling, the prisoner gathered every ounce of strength he had left. He turned to the guard who stood by his bed, watching him with a neutral expression. "Please," the prisoner's voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with desperation. "Please, let me see my daughter, just one last time. I need to see her. I need to say goodbye." The guard, a tough man who had seen his fair share of broken souls in prison, hesitated. He glanced at the prisoner's frail form, knowing full well that the man's time was running out. "You know the rules," the guard said firmly, but his tone softened as he saw the prisoner's pleading eyes. "You're in no condition to see anyone." The prisoner's eyes flickered with sorrow and pain. He had no one else. Emma, his daughter, was the only person who could make him feel human again, even after everything he had done. "I know I don't deserve it," the prisoner continued, his voice breaking. "But if you could just let her know I'm sorry. I've been a terrible father. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need to see her." The guard looked away for a moment, clearly conflicted. He had heard the stories about the prisoner, how he had ruined lives, including his daughter's. Yet, standing there, he saw a man who was broken, a man who knew the end was near and only wanted one final chance to make things right. The prisoner's pleading gaze never left the guard's face. He had nothing left to lose. He wasn't asking for a miracle, just a simple, fleeting moment with the daughter he had abandoned years ago. The guard finally sighed and nodded reluctantly. "I'll make the call, but don't get your hopes up. It's her choice whether she wants to see you." As the guard walked out of the room, the prisoner lay back on the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced with memories of Emma, her laughter as a child, her sad eyes when he failed to show up at important moments in her life. He had always been too proud to admit his mistakes, but now, with only a few days left, he had no choice but to face them. He couldn't die without at least trying to make amends. The prison room grew silent as the prisoner closed his eyes, hoping that Emma would find it in her heart to visit him. He imagined her walking through the door, her face a mixture of anger and pain, but maybe, just maybe, there would be a moment of understanding between them. In the distance, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. He wondered if it was Emma, but the footsteps faded, and he realized it wasn't her. He swallowed hard and clenched his fists, trying to hold back the tears. Time was running out. Meanwhile, miles away, Emma sat in her small apartment, the phone in her hand. She stared at it, knowing the call was coming. Her father, the man who had hurt her in ways words couldn't describe, was dying. He wanted to see her. She had spent years trying to forget him, trying to move on from the darkness he had brought into her life. But now, as she looked at the phone, she couldn't escape the pull of the past. Should she go? Should she see him one last time? Emma had spent so many nights crying over the pain he had caused her. She had grown up without him, raised by her mother who had done her best to protect her from the man who had broken their family. Emma had forgiven her mother, but could she ever forgive him? The thought of seeing her father again stirred a mix of emotions in her. She felt a flicker of something deep inside, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was a longing, a wish that things could have been different, that he hadn't ruined her childhood, that he had been there for her when she needed him the most. But then she remembered all the times he had disappointed her. The broken promises, the lies, the pain. Could she really face him now? Could she find it in herself to forgive him? The phone rang, and Emma jumped, her heart racing. It was the prison. She answered, her voice shaky. "Hello, Ms. Emma," The guard said, his voice calm but serious. "Your father, he's asking to see you. He's dying, and he doesn't have much time left. He wants to say goodbye." Emma felt her throat tighten. The moment had arrived. She could feel her pulse quicken as she fought with herself, torn between the past and the present. She had no idea what to say, what to do. Was she ready for this? She didn't know. The guard's words echoed in her mind, but she was too scared to answer. Would she go to him? Would she face the man who had hurt her so much? The decision weighed heavily on her heart. Emma sat in silence, staring at the phone after the call had ended. Her mind raced, thoughts swirling around her like a storm she couldn't control. The decision felt impossible. For years, she had buried everything about her father deep within herself, hoping it would fade away. But now, after all this time, he was asking to see her, asking for something she wasn't sure she could give. The memories flooded her mind. She could still remember the way he would leave their house without a word, the promises he never kept, the way he turned his back on her mother and her when they needed him the most. She had been a little girl then, hoping, always hoping that one day he would come back and make everything right. But he never did. As time passed, she had learned to live without him, building her own life, away from the shadows of his mistakes. But now, as an adult, the wounds didn't feel any less painful. They were still there, like scars that would never heal. She could still feel the sting of disappointment whenever she thought of him, the anger that had bubbled up inside her over the years. Could she really look at the man who had caused all that pain and pretend everything was okay? Could she forgive him? Her hand shook as she reached for her coat, almost instinctively. She wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do. She wasn't sure if she could face him, but she also couldn't ignore the part of her that still felt connected to him. She knew deep down that seeing him again, even after all that had happened, might bring her some kind of closure, whether she was ready for it or not. With a sigh, Emma grabbed her bag and walked out the door. She didn't know what she was going to find when she got there, or what she would say to him. But one thing was certain: she had to go. The prison was a long drive from her home, and as Emma navigated the roads, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What would he say to her? What would she say to him? How could she look at him without the anger that had built up for so many years? It was hard enough to think of him as a father anymore. All she saw was a man who had failed her, who had walked out of her life without ever looking back. Could she really stand there and let him apologize for everything he had done? The closer she got to the prison, the heavier the air felt. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her stomach twisted with nerves. As she pulled into the parking lot, Emma stopped for a moment to breathe, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She hadn't seen her father in over 10 years, and now here she was, about to face him for the first time since he had left her life completely. The walls of the prison loomed ahead, tall and imposing, just like the walls she had built around her heart to protect herself from the pain. Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine as she walked through the gates, the guards giving her a cold, indifferent look as they checked her identification. It felt strange to be here, and yet somehow familiar. It was a place she had once tried to forget, but now here she was again, standing in front of it, walking toward a part of her past that she wasn't sure she could handle. When she was led into the room where he lay, Emma's heart sank. The prisoner, her father, was a shadow of the man she once knew. He was thinner, frail, his face marked with years of regret, of pain. His eyes, though still sharp, lacked the fire they once had. He looked vulnerable, broken in a way she had never imagined. The guard left the room, leaving Emma and her father alone. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emma could feel the weight of the years they had lost, the distance between them too great to measure. She didn't know where to begin, or even if she should. Her father's voice broke through the silence. "Emma," he whispered, his words barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I know I can't take back what I've done, but I need you to know that I've thought about you every day. I've always regretted leaving you. leaving both of you. I was weak. I didn't know how to fix things." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to turn away, to leave, to run from the man who had hurt her so deeply. But something in his voice, something in the rawness of his words, held her in place. "Why now?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "Why ask for me now, when you never cared before?" Her father looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "I was a coward," he said, his voice cracking. "I made choices that destroyed everything I loved. I can't fix the past, Emma. I can't make up for the years I lost with you. But I want to see you, just once. I want to know that you're okay. I want to make peace before I go." Emma swallowed hard. She wanted to say something, to tell him how much he had hurt her, how much she had suffered because of him. But the words wouldn't come. She just stood there, staring at him, her heart torn in two. The prisoner's hand reached out, shaking. "Please," he whispered, "just one hug. That's all I'm asking. One moment of peace before I die. I don't want to die alone. I don't want to die knowing I never had the chance to say I'm sorry." Her mind was a battlefield, her emotions swirling in chaos. Could she forgive him? Could she ever move past the anger, the hurt? She didn't know. But there was a part of her that wanted to believe him. There was a part of her that longed for the closure he was offering. Emma hesitated, unsure of what to do next. She looked at the man who had been her father, the man who had caused her so much pain, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something other than anger. She felt sadness, and maybe, just maybe, that was a start. Emma stood still, staring at her father, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, making her chest tight and her breath shallow. Every inch of her body screamed to walk away, to leave this room, to shut the door on the past once and for all. But there was another part of her, a part she hadn't expected to feel, that stopped her. It was a small, fragile part, one that whispered she could give him a chance, a final chance. Her father's outstretched hand trembled, his eyes full of hope and regret. "I never wanted to hurt you, Emma," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "But I know I did. I know I failed you. And I'm so sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But if you could just—" His voice faltered, and he wiped his eyes, trying to hide the tears that threatened to fall. Emma's heart ached at the sight. Her father, the man who had been so strong and proud in the past, now appeared small and fragile before her. The anger inside her began to dissipate, replaced by a deep sadness. She had spent so many years hating him, blaming him for every failure in her life. But now, standing in front of him, she saw something else. She saw a man who had paid for his mistakes, who had suffered in his own way, and who was now facing the end of his life alone. For the first time, Emma allowed herself to feel the pain that had been buried for so long. She thought about all the birthdays, the holidays, the moments when she had needed him and he wasn't there. She thought about the nights she cried herself to sleep, wondering why her father didn't love her enough to stay. But now, as she looked at him, she realized that the anger she had carried all these years was just a shield, a way to protect herself from the hurt. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let that go. Taking a deep breath, Emma stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Her father's eyes widened in surprise, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. But then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. The room seemed to hold its breath as their hands touched. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the world had shifted in that moment. The man who had abandoned her, the man who had caused her so much pain, was now holding her hand, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the rage that had consumed her for so long. Instead, she felt a quiet sadness, a sense of loss for the years they would never get back. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad," Emma said softly, her voice trembling. "But I'm here, and I'm listening. I'm giving you this moment, because maybe it's what we both need." Tears welled up in her father's eyes as he squeezed her hand, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Emma, but just knowing that you're here, that you're willing to listen, that means everything to me." The two of them sat there for a while, in silence, neither knowing what to say next. It wasn't a conversation of grand apologies or resolutions, but it was something more. It was a moment of understanding, of acknowledgement that the past couldn't be erased, but it could be faced. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the minutes passed, Emma felt a strange sense of peace beginning to settle over her. She didn't have to forgive him right away. She didn't have to fix everything in one moment. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally letting go of the past, not by forgetting it, but by accepting it. She had carried the pain for so long, but now, with her father there, it felt like she was starting to set it down. Her father's voice broke the silence again. "I wish I could have been there for you," he said, his voice low and steady. "I wish I could have been the father you deserved. I don't know how to make up for all the time we lost, but I want you to know that I love you. I always have, and I always will." Emma felt a lump form in her throat, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The words didn't matter as much as the feeling behind them. In that moment, she knew he was telling the truth. He had made terrible mistakes, but the man sitting before her was trying, in his own broken way, to make things right. She sat there for a few more minutes, her hand still in his, feeling a sense of calm that she hadn't known in years. It wasn't the grand reconciliation she had once dreamed of, but it was real. It was a step toward healing, toward moving forward. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, she was allowing herself to feel something other than anger and pain. She was allowing herself to feel hope. Finally, as the guard came back into the room to signal that the visit was over, Emma stood up, her father's hand still held in hers. He looked up at her, his eyes full of gratitude, and for the first time in a long time, Emma felt something like peace in her heart. "I have to go now," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion that swirled inside her. Her father nodded, his face full of regret, but also a strange kind of relief. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for coming. I'll never forget this." Emma didn't respond right away. She didn't know what to say. Instead, she just gave him a small smile, a smile that spoke volumes more than words ever could. She turned to leave, but before she stepped out of the room, she paused, looking back at him one last time. "Goodbye, Dad," she said softly. "I hope you find peace." And with that, she walked out of the room, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. It wasn't over. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, Emma felt like she was moving forward, leaving the past behind, and walking into a future where she could finally heal. As Emma left the prison, the cool evening air hit her face like a splash of cold water, snapping her out of the heavy, emotional moment she had just shared with her father. Her heart still thudded in her chest, her mind still processing everything that had just happened. She had no idea what would come next, how this encounter would change her, or how it would change the way she viewed her father. Her mind kept returning to the words he had spoken, the raw honesty in his voice. "I love you. I always have. And I always will." Those words had echoed in her mind as she walked away, their weight heavy, but strangely comforting. She hadn't expected to hear them. In fact, she had spent so many years telling herself that they didn't matter anymore. But now, in the quiet of her own mind, she realized just how much they did matter. She had always thought that his love for her was something she would never receive. He had left her when she was a child, and every day since, she had carried that abandonment with her like a stone in her heart. But in that room, for the briefest of moments, she felt something different. Not complete forgiveness, not even full understanding, but a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Connection. Emma's thoughts were interrupted as she climbed into her car. She started the engine, the hum of the motor grounding her back in the present. She wasn't sure where to go or what to do next. All she knew was that the weight she had been carrying for so long had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it was lighter. And maybe, just maybe, that was a sign that she was beginning to heal. The drive back home was a blur, the road stretching out before her in the dark, the headlights cutting through the night. She didn't feel like rushing. She didn't feel like going anywhere. It was as if she was in a limbo, between the past and the future, unsure of what was waiting for her on the other side of this encounter. When Emma finally reached her apartment, she parked and sat for a moment in the car, staring out at the city lights. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a message from her mother. How did it go? Her heart skipped a beat. Her mother had been so clear about never wanting to see her father again. She had always told Emma that he was no good, that he didn't deserve her time or her forgiveness. Emma's mother had built her entire life around the idea of moving on, of putting the past behind them. It wasn't just Emma who had been hurt by her father. It had been her mother too. But Emma knew that her mother wouldn't understand this, wouldn't understand why she had gone to see him. Taking a deep breath, Emma typed out a response, her fingers shaking slightly as she did so. It was hard, but I needed to do it. I'm okay. I'm trying to understand. She stared at the message for a moment before sending it. She didn't expect her mother to respond right away. She had been in her own world for so long, and this was all going to take time to process. Emma put her phone down and stood up from the car, stretching her legs as she walked into her apartment. The familiar surroundings felt different tonight, somehow distant. She hadn't expected to feel this way, but a part of her felt like she was stepping into a new chapter of her life, one that wasn't defined by the anger and resentment she had carried for so long, but by the possibility of healing, of moving forward. She sat down at her kitchen table and poured herself a glass of water, her hands still shaking slightly. It was as if the floodgates of emotion had opened in that prison room, and now she was left to sift through everything that had spilled out. It wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about her own journey, her own healing. And while she didn't know what the next steps were, she knew that this was a start. As she sat there, she couldn't help but think about her father, still lying in that hospital bed. She wondered if he was at peace, if he had found the closure he needed. She hoped he had. And for the first time, Emma realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to hold on to all the anger anymore. It had been a part of her for so long, but now she wasn't sure it had a place in her life anymore. She thought about the future, about what it would look like now that she had taken this step. It wasn't about forgiveness right away. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. But maybe in time, it would be about finding a way to heal from the hurt. And perhaps that was the most important part. As Emma went to bed that night, the stillness of the room felt comforting. She closed her eyes and tried to find peace in the silence. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had taken a step toward it. And for her, that was enough. For now. She didn't know how long it would take to move on, to fully let go of the past, but she knew she was on the right path. And in that small, quiet moment, Emma finally allowed herself to believe that healing was possible, that her heart could mend, one step at a time. Days passed in a blur after Emma's visit to the prison. Each day brought with it a new wave of emotions, a new layer of understanding. She kept thinking back to her father's face, frail and tired, but filled with something she hadn't expected, vulnerability. It haunted her in ways she couldn't fully explain. There were times when she wanted to shove it all away, pretend it never happened. But then she would remember the sincerity in his voice, the quiet plea for her to be there. At work, Emma went through the motions, doing what she needed to do, but her mind was never fully present. It kept drifting back to her father and the weight of the decision she had made. She hadn't been sure what she was walking into when she went to see him, but now she found herself questioning whether she had made the right choice. She hadn't given him the forgiveness he probably wanted. But was that enough? Could there be more to this? More to her ability to move forward? One morning, she walked into her usual coffee shop, the barista giving her a nod of recognition. She ordered her usual, the warm cup of comfort grounding her as she sat by the window, watching the world outside go by. Emma hadn't realized how much she missed this quiet, solitary moment. How much she had been avoiding these moments of stillness in her life. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her mother. "I've been thinking. Maybe we can talk soon. About him. About everything." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected her mother to reach out so soon. She knew it wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but she also knew that it was something they both needed. After all, her mother had carried her own wounds from her father's abandonment. They hadn't spoken much about it, but Emma knew it was still there, buried under years of silence and distance. Taking a deep breath, she typed back a simple message, "I'm ready when you are." Her fingers hovered over the phone for a moment before she hit send. It felt strange to admit that she was ready to talk, to open the door to a conversation she had avoided for so long. But she knew it was necessary. If she was ever going to move forward, truly move forward, it would require both of them facing their past. The rest of the day felt long, every task reminding her that there was unfinished business waiting. But it was different now. She wasn't running from it anymore. The weight of the unresolved issues with her father was still there, but now, it didn't feel like a heavy burden. It felt like an opportunity. An opportunity for closure, for healing, for something she hadn't realized she needed until recently. That evening, her mother called. The tension in Emma's chest tightened as she answered, unsure of what to expect. Her mother's voice came through, hesitant but kind. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did," her mother began. "About going to see him." Emma sat down on the couch, her fingers nervously tapping against her phone. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but I felt like I had to. For me, for both of us." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Emma could hear her mother exhale slowly, as if gathering her thoughts. "I don't know if I could have done it," her mother said quietly. "But I'm glad you did. Maybe we both needed to see him in a way we never allowed ourselves to before." Emma's heart skipped. "You mean, you're not angry?" "No," her mother replied softly. "I'm not angry. I think I'm just tired of holding on to all of this. It's been so long, Emma, and we've both built lives without him in it. But I don't want you to feel like you have to do it all on your own. If you're ready to forgive him, if you think there's something left to heal, I want to support that. And I want to talk about it. I want to understand what this means for you." A lump formed in Emma's throat, and she blinked back tears she hadn't realized were there. It felt like a weight had been lifted from her chest, just hearing her mother's words. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, a chance for both of them to finally heal. "I don't know what forgiveness looks like yet, Mom," Emma said softly, "but I think I'm ready to find out. Not just for him, but for me, and for us." Her mother's voice was filled with quiet emotion. "I'm proud of you, and whatever you need, I'm here." Emma took a deep breath, her heart lighter than it had been in years. It wasn't a complete resolution. It wasn't a perfect ending. But it was a beginning, a new chapter where they could both move forward together. As the days went by, Emma's life slowly began to take on a new rhythm. She spent more time with her mother, talking about everything and nothing, trying to rebuild the connection that had been lost over the years. They shared their pain, their fears, and their hopes for the future. It wasn't easy, but with every conversation, Emma felt the burden of her past getting a little lighter. One evening, as Emma sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, she thought about her father again. She hadn't been back to the prison since that visit, and she wasn't sure when or if she ever would. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to carry his mistakes anymore. She had released herself from the anger and the resentment that had shaped so much of her life. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was the start of something better. She wasn't sure where her journey would take her next, but she was no longer afraid of the unknown. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she was stepping into a future that was hers to shape, and no matter what came next, she knew she could handle it. She had taken the hardest step, And now, with her heart open and her past behind her, Emma was ready for whatever lay ahead. Weeks passed, and life continued its unpredictable rhythm. Emma found herself gradually embracing the quiet moments of peace that had eluded her for so long. Her relationship with her mother, once strained by years of tension and unspoken words, began to heal, inch by inch. They still had their differences, but there was an unspoken understanding now. They were both carrying their own burdens, but they were no longer doing it alone. One afternoon, as Emma sat in the park, watching the leaves flutter in the cool breeze, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from her mother. "I've been thinking about your father. I want to go see him. Are you okay with that?" Emma's heart skipped a beat. The thought of her mother seeing her father, the man who had caused so much pain in their lives, had always been a subject neither of them wanted to touch. But now something had shifted. Emma had taken the first step by visiting him, and her mother had recognized that, in some way, this could be part of their shared healing. She paused for a moment before typing back, "I think it's time. I'll be with you, whatever happens." Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. "Okay, I'll make arrangements. We'll go together." Emma felt a knot form in her stomach, but there was a strange sense of calm that accompanied the anxiety. She wasn't sure what her mother's visit would look like or how it would feel, but she knew it was something they both needed. And this time, Emma would be by her side, ready to face the past, not just for herself, but for both of them. The next day, Emma and her mother drove to the prison together. The silence in the car was heavy, each woman lost in her own thoughts, neither of them speaking the words they were both too afraid to say. The anticipation, the uncertainty, hung between them like a thick fog. They had both seen him in their own way, but this time it would be different. They were doing it together. Emma reached over and gently squeezed her mother's hand, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'm with you," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. Her mother nodded, her eyes glistening with unspoken emotions. "I know, Emma. I don't know what I'll say, but I'm ready. And I think it's time to let go of some of the pain." When they arrived at the prison, the atmosphere was just as cold and impersonal as Emma remembered. The sterile walls, the buzz of the security doors, the distant echoes of footsteps, it was all too familiar. And yet, this time, it felt different. This time, it was about healing, not just for Emma, but for her mother too. As they walked through the halls, Emma noticed how much more vulnerable her mother seemed. She had always been the strong one, the one who never allowed herself to show weakness. But now, as they approached the visitation room, Emma could see the tremble in her mother's hands, the slight tension in her posture. She wasn't just about to confront her past. She was about to face the man who had shattered it. They were led into the room, where her father sat, looking just as frail and tired as Emma remembered. His eyes immediately went to her mother, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Regret, shame. It was impossible to tell, but whatever it was enough to make Emma's heart ache. Her mother stood still for a moment, staring at him, unsure of what to do. Then, as if making a decision, she took a step forward, her voice soft but firm. "I've carried this for too long, James," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The anger, the hurt, it's been too much. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you. But I'm here, and I want to understand. I want to understand why you left, why you couldn't be the father we needed." Her father's eyes filled with tears as he lowered his head, his shoulders shaking with emotion. "I don't have an excuse," he whispered. "I don't have a good reason. I was selfish, and I'm sorry. I was a coward. I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt either of you, but I did. And I regret every day that I wasn't there." The words hung in the air, heavy and painful. Emma could see the raw emotion in her father's face, and for the first time, she believed him. It wasn't an easy thing to accept, and it wasn't something that could be fixed in one moment. But in that room, They were all facing the truth, acknowledging the past in a way they never had before. Her mother's voice softened, a mixture of sadness and resignation in her tone. "I don't know what forgiveness looks like, James, but I can't keep carrying this. I don't know what comes next, but I need to let go of the anger. For me and for Emma." Tears streamed down her father's face as he reached out, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I wish I could change everything. I wish I could undo the hurt I caused. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope this will help. I hope this can be the start of healing." Emma watched as the two of them sat in silence, their shared pain filling the room. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There were no grand gestures, no perfect answers. But in that moment, Emma realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it, facing it, and allowing it to be a part of who they were, without letting it define them. As the visit came to an end, her mother stood up, her voice steady. "I'm going to let this go," she said quietly. "It's time." Emma nodded, feeling a sense of peace that she hadn't expected. Her mother's decision to confront her past, to let go of the anger, was a powerful step, one that Emma could see was starting to free both of them from the chains of the past. As they left the prison, Emma felt a quiet sense of closure settle over her. The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead wasn't easy, but she knew they had taken an important step. They had faced the past together, and in doing so, they had created a new space for healing. And for the first time in a long time, Emma could see a future filled with possibility. Months passed since that day at the prison, and Emma couldn't help but feel that something deep inside her had shifted. It wasn't an instant transformation. Healing rarely worked that way. But the bond between her and her mother had strengthened, and she no longer carried the weight of her past as she once had. The unresolved pain was still there, but it no longer defined her. Every day they took small steps forward, allowing themselves to feel joy without guilt, allowing themselves to be vulnerable without fear. Emma had returned to the life she once knew, but now it felt different. The simple things, like sitting down to a cup of coffee with her mother or sharing a quiet moment in the evening, took on new meaning. She no longer felt like she was just going through the motions. She felt present. She felt at peace. The healing wasn't complete, but it was real. One evening, as Emma sat in the living room of her apartment, she found herself staring at the photo of her father that she had kept hidden for years. She had avoided it for so long, afraid that it would bring back the anger and hurt. But now, after everything that had happened, she felt differently. Instead of resentment, she felt a quiet understanding. Taking a deep breath, Emma reached for the photo frame. It was an old picture of her father, taken when she was just a little girl. Her hand trembled as she held it. But this time, it wasn't because of fear. It was because she finally realized something. She had spent so much of her life resenting the man in this picture, but the person in the photo was someone she had once loved with all her heart. She had been just a child, looking up at him with trust and hope. He hadn't been the perfect father, and he had made mistakes, huge mistakes, but he had been someone she had cared for deeply. And in this moment, she allowed herself to feel that again, without shame. She allowed herself to remember that love. She gently set the photo back down on the table, her hand lingering for a moment. Maybe this wasn't the end of the healing process, but it was a beginning. A beginning that wasn't about forgetting the past, but about accepting it. A beginning that was about forgiveness, not for her father, but for herself. As Emma sat back in her chair, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. It wasn't a perfect peace. It wasn't the kind that erased all the scars, but it was enough to make her feel whole again. The journey of healing was still unfolding, but Emma had learned one of the most important lessons of all. Healing didn't mean erasing the past. It meant learning to live with it, to acknowledge it, and to move forward. It was about finding peace in the middle of the chaos, understanding that life, though filled with pain and loss, also held the potential for new beginnings. Emma smiled softly to herself, knowing that the road ahead would have its challenges. There would be moments of doubt, moments when the past would resurface, but she also knew she had the strength to face whatever came her way. Her past no longer had a hold on her, and for the first time in a long time, Emma felt free. And as she closed her eyes that night, the weight on her heart was lighter. She had healed, and though it had taken time, the journey had been worth it. She had come out stronger on the other side, not just as a daughter or a woman, but as someone who had learned to forgive, not just her father, but herself. And in that forgiveness, she had found the freedom to truly live again. The future was waiting for her, full of endless possibilities, and Emma was ready to embrace it with an open heart.